In the last episode, I explained the difference between the startup costs of a traditional brick and mortar business like a food franchise and a remote bookkeeping business. Now I want to compare the ongoing monthly costs to run those businesses. In other words, the overhead. I'm very familiar with the profit and loss of a food franchise because, as I mentioned before, I actually owned one back in the 90s. But in this instance, I want to show you a recent real-world profit and loss example. This is an actual 2024 profit and loss statement from one of my food franchise clients, and I want to point out a few things. You can see that annual sales were about $866,000. The biggest expenses are highlighted in red, and I really want you to focus on the percentages because that's what tells the full story. Cost of goods sold, or the cost of the ingredients and supplies needed to make the final product, was 27% of sales. The royalty fee paid directly to the franchise was 6%. The required advertising contribution also paid to the franchise was another 5%. Payroll was about 31%, and rent was 13%. Once you add these 5 main expenses to the other smaller expense accounts, the owner ended up with a profit of about 11%, or roughly $98,000 before owner taxes. As you can see, most food franchises operate with very high overhead costs and don't keep nearly as much of the revenue as people think. According to multiple industry resources, many food franchises typically net somewhere in the 5 to 12% range, with strong, well-run locations sometimes reaching 12 to 18%. Now compare that to a remote bookkeeping business. This channel is called Six Figure Bookkeeper because I want to show you how a remote bookkeeping business can realistically generate $100,000 or more per year. So let's use $100,000 in annual sales for this example. Because this is a service-based business, there's no cost of goods sold. This is not a franchise, so there are no royalty fees or required advertising contributions. And in the beginning, you're doing the work yourself, so there's no payroll expenses either. You're also working remotely, so there's no rent expense. So let's take a look at some typical overhead costs for a remote bookkeeping business. All of these percentages are fairly typical for the bookkeeping industry. There are lots of ways to advertise for free in this industry, but as your business grows, you may decide to spend money on advertising to attract new clients. This amount will give you approximately $200 a month to advertise. Insurance is a must, but it's relatively inexpensive in our industry. This amount equates to about $55 per month for insurance, which should be more than enough when you are first starting out. Credit card processing fees are only relevant if you accept credit cards as payment. I don't accept many credit cards, but I do allow certain larger clients to use them for payments. Computer software and web services would include internet access, software subscriptions, website fees, and other online tools needed to run the business. And office expenses cover basic home office supplies and miscellaneous business expenses. So after all expenses are paid, this example shows the business operating margin is about 87%. Typically, you should expect operating margins for a remote bookkeeping business to range somewhere between 75 and 90%. Now think about that for a second. A remote bookkeeping business doing $100,000 in revenue could potentially generate similar owner income to a food franchise doing over $800,000 in sales. That's the power of low overhead. And low overhead is just another major benefit of owning a remote bookkeeping business. Next, I want to talk about another huge advantage, being able to start a business without employees. So make sure you stick around for that.